If you're competitive like me, there's a good possibility that you love board games just as much as I do. So our next project, we're going to be creating our very own board game. There are tons and tons of different board games out there in the world, and there are different categories of types of board games. And we're going to look at a list that Wikipedia has compiled that I think is pretty good to help get us an idea of what type of game you want to create. So one of the first ones is single player board games. I've never personally played any of these three that they listed as examples, but I think of like solitaire when I think of single player games. Probably not something you want to create. If you do, that's fine, but most of the time the excitement of the board game comes from getting to play with other people and trying to beat them. So let's look at some two-player games. Some two-player games that you may be familiar with are like Battleship or Checkers or chess, and you could create some really cool 3D printed pieces with those, even just those three games. Think about all you could do with different chess designs or checkers designs. Not that you're going to be copying any sort of game, but if you wanted to do this sort of game, it creates a lot of different options for you. Multiplayer elimination games. A lot of these I haven't played before, but I think a great example is Jenga. Most people have played some form of Jenga where you go around and the players have to try and pull out a block, and if they make the pieces fall, they have to collect all of those pieces, and the person who ends up with the most pieces at the end is a loser. It's the one who has the least pieces who's the winner. So those are some types of elimination games. Also, you could create some pretty cool pieces with that sort of style of game. Let's see here. Then you've got multiplayer games without elimination. A lot of times that's going to be your typical games, which is why this list is so extensive. You can see it just keeps going and going and going. Some of these I've never heard of, some of them I had. Sorry is a pretty popular game. Scrabble. This one's kind of dependent on if you like word games, which I personally do. And I think they're super fun, and again, I'm super competitive, so I enjoy trying to crush other players when playing Scrabble. But again, another example of a game where you could create different pieces to play with and fit on the board in a specific way. So maybe you don't want it to be a word game, but you have a board that needs to fit a certain size piece, and you would design the specific piece on in Tinkercad. Economics and strategy games. So Monopoly is probably going to be the most familiar with this type of game, where you kind of play like you would in real life, where you're trying to acquire property and build up your personal finances. And there are several different types of pieces in there. You've got your typical pieces like the ones you see here, and you've got money that you need, you've got dice, you've got houses, you've got, I don't remember if it's like apartments, whatever they call the step up from the house. Settlers of Catan. Oh my gosh, do I love this game. You have to be a little bit nerdy to know how to play this game, but I love it. You try and take over the world, just like Risk, try to take over the world. So again, a lot of opportunities for developing your game pieces and themes to your game. Games of physical skill. We may have to be careful on what we play with these types of games in school. Like Twister, we might not play in school, but it's an example of a more of a physical game. Operation could be one that we play, so you have to fit the certain pieces in the body and get them out without touching the edges. Let's see. Jenga they consider a physical game. So some of these games fit into multiple categories. Children's games. This may be a child's game, but who doesn't like playing Candyland? Candyland is fantastic. So if you want to model your game something similar to a game that exists, you just can't copy it, But that's also a great example of a game with a theme. So you're going to want to be thinking about what type of theme you may have for your particular game. Think about maybe if you had a Christmas themed game. Everything would be Christmassy. You'd have Christmas candies, candy canes, snow, gingerbread houses perhaps. So again, be thinking about what type of theme interests you and would work well with your game. Cooperative games. So like it says here, cooperative games are games in which all players need to work together to win. Let me see. I don't think I've ever played any of these examples. I have not. Maybe you have. And word games, again, you're going to be looking at Scrabble, Pictionary, Bananagrams. Oh, I love Bananagrams. Words with Friends, although that's a digital game. So what are you interested in? We're going to be working on this for a while, so make sure it's really something you're prepared to spend a lot of time on. Because not only do you have to design the game, you have to think about designing the board, designing the pieces, creating all the rules, how many players can play at a time, and what type of issues might arise. You're going to have to go through several rounds of designing this game on just the aspects of how you play it to make sure that none of the rules conflict with each other, or maybe say you have a round where it's one person's turn but they draw a card and that card makes another player do an action. Is it now that other player's turn? Does it skip the players in between? That type of thing. You're going to have obstacles in your rules, especially the more complex that you get with your game, the more issues you're going to run into. Not that that's a bad thing. It's just going to take more time and a little more energy on making sure the game plays out correctly. Before you just jump into designing your pieces, I want you guys to take a step back and go one stage at a time. I've developed basically a step-by-step guide into 5 different stages of your board game development, and you need to follow each individual stage. Make sure you're reading through each question to make sure you're thinking about as many of the possibilities as possible and catching all of the instructions that I'm giving, because I'll be taking a grade on these different stages. So in Google Classroom, you will find this Google Doc attached. In each new day that we start a new stage, you will find a new Google Doc for the next stage. But for instance, on this stage 1, you're going to be answering the question of what type of game you're going to be playing, or creating, and the theme of your game. So again, I talked about the theme of that one Christmas one for an example, but that's just one type of theme. Maybe it's an underwater theme, maybe it's a video game theme. Think about what interests you on the theme portion of this. Then how many players can play your game, and most importantly and most complicated, the rules. One of the first things I think it helps to decide on is how does a player win the game, and then going from there you can help develop all the rest of your rules. So are they going to make it to the end of a path like in Candyland? Do they eliminate all the other players' pieces? Do they have to get a certain number of points? I know in Settlers of Catan you have to get 10 victory points. And these aren't the only options. Those are just some questions to get you thinking. Also, how do you know what players go first? Do they roll a dice? Do they start with the oldest player, the youngest player, last one to eat tacos, or something else random like that? What does an entire turn look like? So if I'm the first player, do I start by drawing a card or rolling a dice? And how do I know when my turn is over? And who goes after me? Are we going clockwise, counterclockwise? Do I get to pick who goes after me? Does what happened during the turn determine who goes next? What about if I draw a card or win some sort of skill during my turn? Can I play it during that round, or do I have to wait until the next round? Or are there any sort of punishment cards or squares? Thinking about like your go to jail card in Monopoly. Do you lose a turn? Or maybe, do you have options for players to help other players or harm other players? If you use dice, are there any numbers that are bad to roll? Again, in Settlers of Catan, if you roll a 7, it moves the robber and you get to basically block off another player. So what happens if you roll certain numbers? Think through all of these items and more. These aren't a fully extensive list of all the things you'll have to think about for your rules, but it'll help you get started. After you pick the style of your board game, we are not going to start crafting the board pieces just yet. So don't jump into Tinkercad and start designing just yet. The next step is for you to sketch your board and to make sure your rules work. So sketch your board either on an app on your iPad or with a regular pencil and paper, whatever you're more comfortable with. And then after you have your sketch, I want you to go through the game in your head as if you were playing and apply your rules. This will help you figure out if there are any sort of problems with your rules or issues in the general gameplay that you might not have thought about the first time around. And then adjust your rules accordingly if there are any issues. And that'll be the end of stage 1. Okay, I hope this video helped give you some ideas to get you started. And once you're ready, go ahead and begin.